Hello, and welcome to Waves of YA, a podcast focused on young adult literacy, brought to you by the Ocean County Library's Teen Literacy Work Group. My name is Cecilia. Joining me today, we have
Kristen, one of the Ocean County librarians.
I am Gretchen McNeil, author of 12 young adult novels, the most recent of which is 3 Drops of Blood, a YA thriller.
And today's episode will be focused on books that read like true crime. These are dark and mysterious books with teen detectives that find themselves thrust into the world of crime, be it criminals or murderers. I guess we'll start off with our first question, which is what draws us to true crime? To either write true crime or read true crime?
Well, I think the second influences the first in a way, which is audiences, I think, are drawn to dark things. And so that gives a market for those of us that want to write it. True crime is sort of a subgenre, let's say, of horror, of thrillers, which perennially very popular genres, especially with young people, whether that's film, TV, or in this case, in books. I think there has always been this need for people to experience scares and the dark side of nature in a safe environment. You go see a horror movie, you can watch something terrible happen, but it's not happening to you. You know, you can feel the fear if the author or the filmmaker is doing their job correctly of putting the audience in the shoes of the POV character, but it's not actually happening to you. You're not actually being chased through a cornfield by a chainsaw wielding maniac, but you can experience the fear of that. So true crime is sort of like dialing up the volume on that, because these are things that did happen to people. These are, you know, sociopaths who did horrible things, but they're not doing them to us.
Thankfully.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. You get to experience that in a fictional and safe environment. You can close the book. You can change the channel if it gets too intense.
Exactly.
You get the idea and the fear of everything and the adrenaline rush without actually being in harm's way.
Yes. And, you know, it's so interesting. I have a lot of friends who tell me all the time, oh, I can't read your books. You know, they're too scary. I don't do horror. I mean, I think we've all heard this from peers, from family members. I don't do horror. But those are the same people that'll sit down and listen to a true crime podcast, watch a documentary series on serial killers, but not view it as horror. Except that in some ways, at least to me, someone who crafts horror for a living, the true crime stuff is more terrifying because it did happen.
That's how I feel too. I'm like, how are you can watch a fictional serial killer, but
I think there's also like a little bit of morbid curiosity, like the same as rubbernecking that happens after a car accident. It's like, I'm not in it, but that's scary. And that could happen to a person just like me because I'm driving my car on the same exact road with the same exact other people.
Yeah.
Maybe there's also a, how would I get out of this? Maybe I could escape this if it happened to me mentality as well. Looped in.
What would I do in that situation?
Exactly.
And we love to, as people, have the illusion of control. Like, well, if I plan enough for this, then I know that I wouldn't run up the stairs. I would definitely run this way, and I would get in my car and I would go and I would be safe.
I would not allow them to take me to a secondary location, right? I would be in charge of that.
Yes. Yes. I would be like, no, don't murder me. Like, you can't do that. It's not in the plans, but we really do. It's a way to try to control, like, you get the fears, but you also get this sense of, well, maybe I would be, but like, these things are not in people's control. You don't have control over being abducted. And it's an illusion.
And I think there's the piece of us that think these victims were unprepared for the situation or not smart enough to deal with the psychology of their captor or whatever, which is all, crap. There's if you're in that situation, we all probably would end up as many of these victims did, which is dead. But we want, like you said, that illusion of control.
When I watch or read true crime, it's a story. Like, even if it's true, it's like
it's
has
presented
like
in a narrative. Yes.
So like in theory, there's some justice. They're not being served at the end, or you want to believe that good prevails at the end of it. Right. Because
honestly, if you're profiling a serial killer, it's probably because that serial killer had been caught, tried, convicted. Because we knew about them.
Or if it's someone that didn't get tried and convicted, it's the thought of maybe if I read or watch enough of this, maybe I can figure it out.
Like
the armchair detectives.
Yes, and some of them have. So then it feeds that even more. Like, I could figure this out. I think that it takes a lot to be able to do that, and having more people, like more minds doing it, I assume also contributes to the success. What makes a story fall into the reads like true crime genre?
The reality is the reality, which is, could this happen in a real world? So I've mostly written books that do not deal with paranormal, supernatural elements. I do have some, and I love those as well, but I have definitely been drawn to the horror that men do unto themselves, as opposed to the things that a supernatural entity does. So things that could happen when you read them in a book, 3 Drops of Blood, the precursor, Dig Two Graves, these are about teen girls caught up in something that could happen. In the first, a girl who gets ensnared by a sociopath, essentially, in a very toxic friendship. And the second is a girl witnessing a double murder, and no one believes her except the killer, who knows that she saw what she saw. And then the book that's coming out next year, which is called 4-Letter Word, which is about a girl whose family is hosting an Italian exchange student, and she's the only one who believes that he's neither a student nor Italian, and he may just be a notorious serial killer on the run, which she knows about because she is obsessed with a true crime podcast that's been talking about this Casanova killer. So these things could all theoretically happen. I mean, there is, like I said, a narrative device of storytelling. So things are going to happen in a specific way so that the story plays out in the way that we as consumers of story expect them to. But it's not aliens. Okay, I'm going to apologize to all of you who believe that we have actually been visited by aliens. It's not aliens landing. It's not ghosts. It's not vampires. It's not werewolves. It's something that could actually happen.
It's true. It's in the title, true crime.
Exactly.
I was just going to say, in 3 Drops of Blood, the juxtaposition of like the things that she sees, she's like filing. Right?
Yeah.
And it's like, filing is boring.
So boring.
Like, so boring, so boring. Monotonous. It's just like putting things away in files. And like, there's all this action that she's seeing and doesn't have the ability to like interfere with.
Right. And initially living vicariously through. So her initial encounters, voyeuristically with this female character she dubs Ripley because it reminds her of Sigourney Weaver's character from Alien, this large and in charge boss lady. It's definitely, she wants to live like this woman, this strong boss lady who's having an affair with her hot 20-something assistant, who laughs in the face of her husband when he comes to confront them. She's the person that Kate wants to be, confident, in charge of her own destiny. And then what happens when that turns dark? And then no one believes you. There's no body. They can't find any bodies. So what do you do?
Yeah. She sees that she wants, like, she's got the life I want. It's all intrigue and it's interesting and she's so strong. And then it's like, I wonder if at the end, she's like, maybe I'd like to just keep filing things.
Right. I mean, I think
so
Kate's journey is certainly one of maybe I should enjoy the life that's right in front of me, as opposed to yearning for something that's maybe a little unattainable right now.
Yeah. And maybe you don't want it.
Yeah.
The other thing, going back to the question, the other thing that relates to true crime is stories that are ripped from the headlines. Like you see those Law and Order episodes that are like based on things that are happening in the day. And I know Tiffany D. Jackson does a lot of ripped from the headlines stories. I think most of her books are. I read an article and now here's a story about it, said article. Those all have like scandals and twists and layers upon layers of different situations and peoples and suspects going on. I think that's also what draws us in too.
Yeah, you'd always like the truth is stranger than fiction. You know, if I wrote that, no one would believe it. And yet things that really happened
have happened. Yeah.
I think it's also nice to have a fiction in. And there is a difference between, if we're talking about Tiffany D. Jackson's books, there's a different feel to Weight of Blood, which very much could be true and is sort of ripped from headlines with, I'm not going to give the book away, but that book, reading that book versus reading Grown, which is also inspired by true things. They feel very different, but it's an in for, because you look at Grown and you're like, that could never happen. But it very much
But of course it
did.
could. I mean, even, you know, my Murder Trending series, which, you know, are billed as dystopian thrillers. I didn't intend them to be dystopian. I intended them to be 5 minutes in the future, which is why there isn't futuristic technology. It is a very recognizable world in those books. And it really is a satire of politics, social media, the need for the masses to be entertained. You know, that goes back to ancient times. We have always loved a good spectacle. Romans used that to control the populace very, very effectively. And the need for that comes through with this true crime obsession, right? Which is we need to be sort of entertained by horrible things that are happening. The tone for a book like Murder Trending is definitely more satirical. It's meant to be presented in a humorous way, like, oh, this could never happen. But when you think about it, it could happen, especially looking at the last presidential regime and, you know, what they did and what they tried to do. Like, could it have gone another way? Could it have turned into this? I think most people would read the book and say, yeah, I could see a world where something like Murder Trending has happened, you know, an island with corporal punishment that's streamed live for people to subscribe to.
I think that leads into one of the other questions we have, which is, was writing in this style for 3 Drops of Blood different from writing #Murder Trending, which you've described as not meant to be dystopian, but still has that kind of feel? What was the difference in writing between those two books?
The Murder Trending series, again, not meant to be dystopian, but definitely meant to be over the top. You know, it's populated by these government sanctioned serial killers who are all thematic, like, you know, they're all showing up to be contestants on Let's Make a Deal or something. And it's silly. It's an older woman who works at a craft store who murders people. It's someone who dresses up like Robin Hood and murders people. Like, it's silly. It's meant to be silly because I think that emphasizes the horror of what's happening, of people rooting and betting on how, in this case, young people are going to be brutally murdered. You have to take away some of the satirical tone and the over-the-top character of the writing with a book like 3 Drops of Blood, because it's meant to feel real. Now, would the events of 3 Drops of Blood happen? I mean, not necessarily, but they could happen. They could happen tomorrow. Whereas Murder Trending would have to happen a year or two in the future, theoretically. So I stripped away some of the over-the-top nature of the voice and the tone, and of course, all the trappings, and made them feel real, but still maintained some humor in Kate's voice, because I don't think I can write a book that's completely devoid of humor. It's just not possible for me. But it is definitely a different approach. When I wrote Murder Trending, the first book, I really expected at every moment for my publisher to say, this is too much. You've gone too far. This is so over the top. And they never did. Thankfully, they never did. Because I think that's what makes that book really special, is that it's so over the top. But a book like 3 Drops of Blood is not going to feel realistic if the world seems like it's dialed up to 11.
Yeah, it's more grounded than the over-the-topness of hashtag Murder Trending. Yeah.
You know, some of the characters in 3 Drops of Blood, like Bella, who's the sort of teen diva film TV star, you know, she's very much a stock character of what people expect a Hollywood starlet to be like in 2023. That said, I spent enough time in this town. I live in Los Angeles and have worked in and around the industry for 20 plus years, that there are plenty of people who make that stereotype realistic because that's how they act. And so she may feel like a little bit like a Commedia dell'arte stock character, but the reality is there's plenty of those people in this town that populate the entertainment industry. And so she probably feels more real because that is a bit of the expectation for that type of character.
Do you think some of the over the top of Murder Trending, the stuff that was elevated violence, made, who decided it was going to be promoted as dystopian? And if you can get away with more of that over the top stuff, even though it actually could be true, because they're marketing it as dystopian, as opposed to like, this is 5 years from now, buddies.
Yeah, the funny thing is that my publisher, Disney, really didn't throw that. They didn't use the word dystopian at all. It was reviewers, you know, for the most part. And I think part of it is a lot of people who actually hadn't read the book yet and just read the blurb about what it was about. And it feels Hunger Games, you know, it feels like that, except it's not, nor is it meant to be. But I think that is where the sort of word got attached to the book and to the series.
To me, that's really interesting because this is your baby. You put it out into the world, and then other people
get to decide who
to name it.
Well, and honestly, that's what art means. Yeah. Right. That I get to create it. But once I put it out for consumption, I no longer control at least what people think of it. I can control what's on the page. I can control what happens to it, in that if a film producer wanted to make a movie version of it, but wanted to change everybody to talking unicorns or something, I could say, you know what? I don't think I want to sell this to you. That's as far as my control really goes.
Yeah.
I don't control what people think of the book. I don't control how people describe the book when they talk about it. And that's okay. I put the words on the page. I build the world. I create the characters and their voices. And then the interpretation is left to the audience. I don't know how Shakespeare would feel about the way characters like Romeo and Juliet are lauded. I'm not sure that was the intent. But we don't know because we can't ask him. No. All we can do is interpret the words that he wrote in whatever way it speaks to us.
Maybe that's why I'm not an artist, because like there's an amount of trust. You have to trust the fans. You have to trust the readers. And I'm very much like, no, that's wrong.
I think the reality is that you have to be able to let go. And I know a lot of writers, a lot of artists in general, but because I spend a lot of time with writers, I know a lot of writers who can't not respond to a review where they feel that the reader didn't understand something. I have had plenty of reviews of my books, both by readers and professional industry reviews, where they clearly did not understand what was happening, or maybe hadn't actually read the whole book. But it is not my job to respond. if I didn't do a good enough writing job to keep them entertained, to make my points very clear, that's on me. But I am not here to explain to somebody what they didn't get about my book. You have to let it go. If you cannot, you shouldn't be creating art. I mean, that's just my opinion. Because it'll eat you alive. It really will.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. If you nitpick on everything that everybody has said.
Well, and that also, I will say that is not just the bad reviews. You have to take all reviews of your work with a grain of salt. I can't say I'm going to ignore the bad reviews and only accept the good ones. People who tell me I'm brilliant and people who tell me I'm terrible, I can't hang on to either of those, and I definitely can't cherry pick which ones I'm going to allow in to influence me. It's other people's opinions. I appreciate the ones who think that I'm brilliant, but I understand the ones who think that I don't, and I try not to internalize either.
So backtracking again, back to true crime. Do you think that true crime as a genre presents any risks? I'm specifically thinking of people dressing as Dahmer for Halloween after the show came out, or it's not necessarily true crime, but it watches like true crime. You have you and everyone's like, yeah, go Joe. And you're like,
yeah.
What about that guy?
Yeah.
What about that guy?
If you're going to classify true crime enthusiasts as being potentially influenced unhealthily, then you have to say the same for the people who dress up as Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees. There is no difference, I think, in the way that people interpret these as stories, right? Jeffrey Dahmer's, the movie, an actor portraying a true person in a film that has been crafted as a story is not a whole lot different than a horror film that is dealing with fictional people that's being presented as a story. Movies like Psycho was heavily influenced by Ed Gein, who was a real life serial killer. My book, 4-Letter Word, is a young adult homage to Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt, which was influenced by Earl Nelson, another serial killer known as the Black Widow Killer. And nobody remembers that, but no one's talking about Psycho or Shadow of a Doubt as being a negative influence on people, but they are fictionalized story accounts based on things that actually happened. Do they influence violence? Do video games influence violence? Do movies about car racing or sword fighting or whatever influence people to become violent? Not necessarily. I think the tendency for humans to be violent to each other predates media. And so I don't think we can blame it on those things. I think the fandom for serial killers, while it is not my cup of tea, is no different than the fandom for fictionalized serial killers, fictionalized murderers, fictionalized horror characters. Again, it's people taking control by assuming the persona of someone they view as having had a lot of it.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Like, I had to think about that a second. How is it different? How is it different to dress like Ghostface versus to dress like
Ted Bundy?
Yeah.
Ted Bundy just looked like everybody else. But the idea, of course, is you're somehow more deficient as a human because you're celebrating someone who actually did something terrible as opposed to somebody who was just a fictionalized account of doing something horrible. And I get that. If my kid was like, I want to be Jeffrey Dahmer for Halloween, I might have a moment of questioning many things, including my own parenting. But that said, I don't think it would intrinsically make my child any more violent than if he wanted to dress up as Freddy Krueger. Of course, my kid is 4.5. So if he wanted to do either of those things, I think my parenting skills should be brought into question.
How do we ensure that true crime victims are handled with respect in the telling of these stories?
Oh, that is such a tough one because, again, convicted criminals are prevented from earning money from telling the stories of what they did, especially where victims are concerned. Even someone who was not convicted of a double homicide like O.J. Simpson, but was convicted of a civil offense in that case, when he tried to write a book about it, the assets were seized due to the civil ruling against him, right? So we as readers, let's say, I'll take the writer's side out of this. We as readers can't do anything other than to not consume the media that is perhaps disrespectful to people who were victimized, right? Because there's always going to be somebody who is going to use those stories to make a buck. And there's probably always going to be an audience for it. So we can't control a lot of that. As a content creator, I can choose not to use actual victims, the actual details of a true crime case in my stories. And I think that's the only way I can control it, is not to use it in my own writing. In fact, I just finished a manuscript that my agent has. It's an adult horror novel that has some elements that were loosely based on a case that actually happened. It's not true crime, but it was a case of 5 men who disappeared in the mountains, and 4 of the 5 bodies were recovered eventually, but nobody kind of knows how they got there. And a few of the details in my story were inspired by them, and I put a dedication in the book to those 5, if it ever gets published, to those 5 men as a way of remembering what happened to them. But I'm not speculating about what happened to the 5 of them. They are not characters in the novel. I just used some elements of their story. So I definitely wanted to be respectful of their memory and their families, even though this was something that happened decades and decades ago. But I certainly would not, if a family member came to me and said, don't put that in this book, I would have to respect that, but that's just me. So.
You're respecting the victims and their family members if they are uncomfortable with certain things.
Yeah.
I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, watch a lot of true crime YouTube. And sometimes they'll have the victims' families come on and tell the story themselves, trying to get justice served, whether that is having the case reopen or using their platform in order to reinvigorate police to get involved in the case once again. So making sure they're using their voice to amplify the victim and the victim's family's voices. I think that's one way of showing respect.
It's more difficult in a fictionalized account, right? But I mean, as an author, we can use author's notes,
right,
as sort of a direct address to the reader about where the story came from, or perhaps pieces of it that were lifted from things that actually happened, and almost like a postlude in a film, where they'll have up in the actual case, blah, 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 blah. So, there's definitely ways to do that even in fiction.
It probably has nothing to do with the question, but when I was writing down notes, documentaries will have like a skewed perspective sometimes. I feel like it's hard to be unbiased in the setting or just telling the story as is, but sometimes it'll lean more towards sympathizing with the criminal or lean more towards a certain perspective or direction. I don't know what my point is with that, but that was just something I observed in true crime, because I'm reading right now One of Us is Back, and the criminal in that is getting a documentary which was skewed more in that direction. Spoilers, I guess. I'm very early into the book.
Just checked it out, so
yeah, okay.
I'll be a little behind you, but
that got me thinking, because you're in the perspective of the characters who have actually been victimized, and you know what this person does, but then the public gets that different perspective because he was presented in a certain way in a documentary. And I know that has been a subject of recent documentaries that have come out, or fictionalized versions of stories that skew in one direction or another.
Which is, not to get too in the weeds, but my husband, who's an entertainment attorney, before he was an entertainment attorney, he made biographies. He wrote, directed, and produced like 30 episodes. And so we've talked about this because we watch a fair number of documentaries, and he gets very upset when the filmmaker inserts themselves into the narrative. And that is when the filmmaker takes a stance. A documentary should be documenting events.
Yes.
And leaving interpretation up to the viewer to some extent, right? Or if it's not a true crime documentary, it's a slice of life. You can still have a narrative arc of a character or multiple characters that you're following, but you're not inserting yourself as the filmmaker into that. So I do not love it when documentaries are presented in that way. I think it's, if you want to write a narrative story about a true crime, then make a movie, write a screenplay.
Yes.
Not right now, not during the strike, but write a screenplay, write a novel version of it. But don't pass it off as a documentary if you're skewing things based on whatever agenda you have. It is not then, in my opinion, a true documentary.
Yeah. Documentaries are supposed to document the facts of the case.
Exactly.
And not have that sort of narrative like, oh, well, this is how I feel.
Because when it becomes a narrative, you don't include everything. You know,
that doesn't agree with the story I'm telling, so I'm just going to push that to the side, and we'll just hide that evidence underneath the carpet.
Exactly. Like if I was writing a film about, I don't know, the gunpowder plot in 17th century England, there's no explosion, right? There was no explosion. So there's no climax in the third act other than that the conspirators were all caught and horribly tortured and then all executed. There's no explosion. There's no there. So if I was writing the fictionalized version of that, I would write an explosion because you need one, right? But if you're making a documentary about it, you can't put that in just because you need a big moment in Act 3, right? So that is where true life doesn't always line up with a 3-act narrative structure for a story that we want to tell. And if you're taking a stance and you're creating a narrative around an opinion that you want to share, the odds are pretty good that you are going to leave out some of those documented facts in order to fit the narrative that you've created. And at that point, it is no longer an actual documentary. You know, it's an op-ed.
So do you have any favorite books? Feel like true crime / any podcasts you'd like to recommend?
Well, you know, it's funny. I don't listen to any of the true crime podcasts. I never have. I was never really interested in it. And I get asked that all the time. And I guess I'm one of the few authors who write thrillers who's never listened to Serial, but I've never listened to Serial. I do, however, love Only Murders in the Building. I think it's a fantastic show, and I love the premise of it. I think it's such wonderful, silly fun.
They work so well together.
Yeah, I know.
The cast.
You would not, if you pulled those names out of a hat, I'd be like, huh. But Martin Short is, you know, I know he's Canadian, but national treasure. So in terms of novels, like the books that I love that are sort of based on potentially real things aren't necessarily true crime, but books like The Exorcist, you know, that the movie was based on, is based on true events. We'll call it true events as opposed to true crime, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I love about the book, especially less so I love the movie. It's one of my favorite horror movies of all times, but the book is about what happened to this boy in the case of the novel, and it's not clear exactly what happened, right? So it's a little fuzzy, and I think the true account of that, if you read the true accounts of what actually happened, is very I don't believe in a lot of this stuff, so I should put that out there. But Amityville Horror is another one where it's like this thing that happened and you're like, huh, is it real, is it not? But then creating the fictionalized version of it is much more interesting. The Bell Witch, so it's a lot of based on true events that may not have actually been supernatural, but we're going to create this potentially supernatural narrative around it and creating a story. I love that more than necessarily like the true crime aspects of storytelling, but based on true events, we'll call it that.
When I was writing out my list of books, a lot of the ones that kept coming up were a crime happened in the past and now it's happening again to the new students or the new teens of the town. To Keep a Secret is like that.
Well, Ellie Marnie's None Shall Sleep, and then the sequel just came out. It's not necessarily happening again to teens because the premise of the book is that someone who had previously escaped a serial killer is now a teenager who has been approached by the FBI to come work in Quantico. And
as you do.
Yeah, as happens, very common, to help catch a copycat. And I mean, for me, that's the least. I'm like, do they really recruit? Do they have junior recruits there just hanging out at the Jeffersonian? But that's another where like something comes back from the past and now it's very horror movie, even though it reads like a true story. It reads like a true crime because it's a serial killer, but it's very Freddy versus Jason. And we keep going. And there's Jason 3D and all of the different Friday the 13th iterations. It always comes back. It's sort of a horror trope that then bleeds into the real life or the more real thing that's happened before and will happen again.
Grounded true crime stories. Yeah. Contemporary crime stories. I hope you're listening is sort of like that too. Her friend was kidnapped. And then that comes back around with a new case that kind of falls into a similar line.
So the similar with, what's the one with Stevie Bell?
Truly Devious.
Yeah, the Truly Devious series. Something happened and now it's going to come back and get us in a different way, but we have to solve the crime.
But it's the same thing. It's a different perspective on like an old crime that's coming back around, and like these new kids will solve it, as opposed to the whatever happened back in the day.
Which is I think a well-worn device. Right. And device sounds pejorative and it's not meant to be, trust me. But because it gives the protagonists, the modern protagonists, research to do, right?
Yes.
The mystery to uncover, not just in real time in terms of confronting what's actually happening, opening doors, whatever. It's going back and researching a thing. We see this in all different types of genre stories. The idea that you have to, we see it in romance and we see it in all kinds of things, that you have to research something that happened in the past to figure out something in the present. I don't know why. We love that. We love reading those. Yes. We love it.
I think, again, that comes back to some of the, like, if I do this now, I can control what had happened. I mean, like, It, like Stephen King's It. We're going to go back and we're going to do it again and we're going to do it right this time.
We're going to take control because now we're adults and we sort of can.
Oh, yeah. And adults know what we're doing.
Yeah.
Definitely. For me, that's the horror. It's like all of the premise of a lot of YA is we got to get rid of these parents because if the parents were here, it would get figured out real quick. Yeah. And I'm like, I don't know.
Or they just be like, call the police.
Yeah. I don't know if
I'm calling the police. Yeah.
About adults, but we're like grown up teenagers. Yeah. We don't know how to do much. We're winging it. We're all winging it.
Still struggling it.
But you definitely have to get rid of parents in some regard because they would take control of the situation.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether they would solve it any better or worse than the rest of us, they would take control.
Yes.
And you don't want your main character's parents to become the main actors in your YA novel. So you have to get rid of them. And, we've all done it in a variety of ways, whether it's in my book 10, they're a bunch of teens at an island house party with no adults present. Like, great, easy way to strip it away. They're just not there. You don't have to kill them. You just have to make sure that they're not there.
Because it would be a really short book. And then my mom called the police.
Yes.
And they took over the scene.
Right? Exactly.
You can never call the police into any of these books either.
Or if you do, I mean, I had to do this.
Yeah.
I had to do this in 3 Drops of Blood, which is, she's like, oh, I'm not messing with this. I'm calling the police. And it actually happens twice in the book. And there are reasons why, she is not believed, but I had to make sure that it was realistic.
Yeah.
That she wouldn't just be that teen that's like, oh, I'm not calling the police. I'm going to solve this murder. I'm going to take down this killer who killed 2 people on my own. That seems totally realistic. Like, in this book, she doesn't have a choice.
And it wouldn't make sense for her as a character to not have called the police. She just wasn't that kind of a person.
Exactly. But you do have to kind of dance around it. Like in 10, I had to strip out their connection to the world. So I had to take out cell phone towers, take out cable, internet, make sure that there was no way for them to contact the outside world. Again, it would be a very short book if they could just pick up the phone and be like, we got a dead body.
Drop a pin.
Send someone,
Yeah, I think you do a really good job in Dig Two Graves of getting rid of the parents too.
Yes. And in Dig Two Graves, Neve's dad, I'm definitely not trying to infantilize an adult or to use mental health as a plot point. But I think with mental health crises during and post-pandemic being so front and center and being focused a lot on teens, as it should be, who really went through a horrific ordeal during the lockdown, but dealing with parents that have mental health issues has been a common theme in my books. Not, by the way, I mean, I was raised by a single parent for a reason, and my single parent does not have mental health issues, but the parent that was not around certainly did. I should say wasn't around much. And Neve's dad needs to be taken care of. He is not entirely capable of dealing with her issues. And then, of course, his problems and her need to protect him from them becomes a motivation for her not necessarily being forthcoming with the police. And then, of course, her mother just working all the time because she's the sole breadwinner for the family. Again, you're just sort of giving real reasons why people are not around.
Grounded.
And I grew up in, I was a kid in the 80s. I was a teen in the 90s. Like, I had a cell phone, but you didn't leave it on. Texting was not a thing. It had an LCD screen. And if you wanted to send a text, it would send you 15 minutes to write like 3 words of text. There wasn't a tether on us. We were sort of free range Gen X kids. And we, hope you come home. We're going to start calling around to all the houses to find out where you are if you don't come home.
Yeah.
But we had that autonomy, and I definitely add a lot of that to my characters. And I think that helps with these stories, that these kids have autonomy to get around, to go places, to do things. I don't know how realistic that is these days. I feel like kids don't always have that kind of tetherless existence. So it might be a little bit of nostalgic wishful thinking on my part that I add that with my characters, but I definitely think that it helps them in the pursuing of the mystery that they need to solve.
Yeah. The days of using a payphone at the mall to call collect, and then when it says, who is it? And you're like, pick me up at the mall.
Yeah, exactly. Before exactly.
Pick me up at the mall. Yes.
Oh my God. We'll pass old phone booths, or we'll be watching a movie at there's a phone booth in it. And my husband always says in a kid voice, Grandpa, what's that booth they're standing in? Because these kids have no idea what it is.
But I think that there's currently a lot of nostalgia for late 80s, early 90s with like Stranger Things and with a lot of the tropes that we see in YA literature and I don't know whether that is initiated from the teens because it's a thing that they like, so it's popular, or we're just all that age. And so
I think it's both. I mean, you see it in fashion too, like,
you
know, the high waist, straight leg, baggy crop jeans. I was like, wow, it's 1989 again. Holy moly. Holy moly. If mullets are back. So I don't know. But I do think that there's also a lot of the authors writing a lot of these books are of a certain age.
Yeah.
Not all, I mean, but a lot of us.
Yeah, it certainly inspires a lot of adults reading YA.
Yeah.
Which has always been a thing. Let me just say this. While our books are geared towards a teen reader for a lot of reasons, including you wonderful librarians who need to be able to put the book into the hands of an actual teenager, knowing that the content speaks to their experience as opposed to, a book about a 40-year-old divorced woman finding love for the third time. Like it's not as super relevant to your average 16-year-old. Not that they can't read that, but when you're acquiring for your libraries and you need to make justifications about the books that you acquire, me writing a book specifically geared towards a 16-year-old really helps you with that. That said, we all know that at least half of the books that we sell are going to be purchased by and read by adults for adults. And we know that.
Yeah.
So, we're sort of towing a line a lot of the times in what we're writing and how we're writing it. And I do think that Gen X flavor coming through now is speaking to obviously the adult reader more than the teen reader.
And I think going back to true crime, I think that subject line is popular with both age groups too.
Very.
So adults are going to pop in and read the YA true crime, and teens are going to also pop in and read it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have a lot of teens that want to read true crime, but for the majority of them, it's not as fun to read it in the non-narrative form.
Yes.
So if you just pick up the book and there's all these footnotes and all this like, oh, well, and here's the references, it's not as appealing. So having true crime-ish fiction also helps to get them a taste of what they're looking for, or at least finding them narrative true crime. Because it's so much easier to digest, even for me. I would prefer to read
I don't want to
that.
sit through. I don't want to read a lot of footnotes,
No.
In my salacious stories. When I teach writing, when I teach about dialogue, I tell my students all the time, go read the transcript of a court case. It's actual people saying actual words, and it's absolutely unreadable because human beings don't speak in cohesive sentences. So while everyone and their mother will tell you, you got to write realistic dialogue. Realistic dialogue is people speaking in fragments with a lot of pauses, repetition. That is not what you want in your book. It doesn't have to be 100% authentic. You don't have to go sit at Starbucks and record the conversation happening behind you and then transcribe it. You want it to feel like people are actually having a conversation, but without the trappings of sort of nonfiction transcription. And it's the same thing, like reading the nonfiction story is going to be many times less enjoyable than the fictionalized account.
Another subgenre aspect of true crime that I was noticing in the list of books I wrote down is they're always connected either to the victim, the criminal, or they're close to one of them for some reason. I think that brings you more into the story, whether it's their mother was involved in the crime in the past, or like their best friend was kidnapped when they were little, or
well, I think you need a plausible trigger for why this is happening, right? A plausible catalyst, I suppose, is a better word for why this is happening to this character. Although realistically, there's a horror movie called The Strangers with Liv Tyler, and it's about a husband and a wife who go visit a family cabin, and these three people show up and do terrible things. And at the end, without spoiling it, Liv Tyler's character asks, why us? And the attackers say, because you were home. That there was a randomness to it. If they hadn't decided to go to this cabin on that day, would this have happened? And so that to me is one of the most terrifying moments in any horror movie I've ever seen, because it speaks to the randomness of that crime, which we don't always address in novels. Like there's usually a reason why things are happening to our characters.
And I think the true crime stories, there is that sort of the lack of control we were talking about. There's really no reason for the victims to have been victims. And in fictionalized stories, there's a plot, there's a reasoning, there's some kind of structured narrative to the whole thing, which I think is again why teens feel safer or more interested in reading the fictionalized versions than the true crime versions, the actual nonfiction.
Because it again gives you that illusion that like, well, if I don't make friends with the girl whose sister was kidnapped when she was a child, then perhaps I can avoid this whole
plot.
Well, and also, you know, to get into the craft of writing a little bit, if you're reading a first person past tense narrative or a third person past tense, the past tense of it is the conceit is, I'm going to tell you about this thing that happened.
It's already happened. You know,
so it's already happened.
Possibly survived.
Yeah.
So who's ever telling the story has survived it, or at least up until the point where they're telling the story, which is, you know, another narrative device you can use where you catch up and then you move forward in the present tense. Present tense story is come along on this journey with me, and at that point, you're like, all bets are off. And I do think that's why present tense has become a more popular narrative device for storytelling, because if you don't want the conceit of your POV character, your narrator, telling the story from some point in the future, then the only way to do that really is to tell it in present tense, or to make the whole narrative be a journal that someone found. You know, there's ways to get around it, but if you want to strip away the illusion of safety for your main character entirely, then that's one way to do it.
So you have an upcoming novel. Do you have things you want to promote?
Yeah. 3 Drops of Blood was out earlier this year. We've talked a little bit about it, but I should probably just pitch it since I haven't yet. It is the second of my sort of Hitchcock reimaginings. For the record, I'm a huge Alfred Hitchcock fan, as I am a huge Agatha Christie fan, and both of their works feature prominently in my influences. 3 Drops of Blood is a YA Rear Window, which is one of Hitchcock's masterpieces. The movie is about a photographer who breaks his leg and is stuck in his New York apartment, bored out of his mind while he recuperates, and watches the goings-on of the apartment directly behind him and witnesses what he thinks might have been a murder. And so I wanted to reimagine that for a modern teen protagonist. So the story follows Kate, who is an actress in Hollywood, sort of an accidental actress. She gets cast from an open call audition that she only attended with her best friend who desperately wanted the part. And she's just shot the first season of a Netflix show that's premiered. It's gotten a ton of viewers. It's a huge hit. And then the showrunner, the very married and very adult showrunner, gets arrested for having an affair with the very underage starlet, who then goes on social media and posts an ill-timed defense of their love, at which point Netflix cancels the show. Meanwhile, our main character, Kate, has decided she really does want to pursue an acting career, so much so that she's going to forgo her senior year of high school and not go to college, which does not sit well with her professor and teacher parents, who tell her that if she's going to do this, she has to start paying rent and room and board. And the only way to do that is to get a job, because her agent won't send her on auditions because she's tainted by this scandal. So she gets a job filing in her best friend's dad's law firm, and she's the night file clerk, so she can theoretically go to auditions during the day. And that is when she gets very involved in the goings-on of a woman in the office building opposite hers, and then witnesses that woman kill both her assistant and her husband, but no one believes her except the killer, who is coming after her next. So that is 3 Drops of Blood. And it will be followed by 4-letter word, which I did pitch. It's the Italian exchange student, possibly serial killer. And that is out in March of 2024, which is honestly right around the corner practically.
Sure is.
Thanks for joining us today. Be sure to check out the Ocean County Library's website for more podcasts and events. All titles mentioned in today's episode can be found through the Ocean County Library, free with your library card. Until next time, happy reading.